Okay, it's a great pleasure to introduce Anupama Shukla to you for this afternoon. We'll be talking about representing the borderlands, understanding epilepsy. Anupama.
Right. So I will be talking about, I think, something that is very different. Basically, I'm talking about literature and how epilepsy is presented as a trope in literature. And I will be examining how epilepsy has been used to portray disorder or chaos in society, and how the epileptic most often appears as a disorderly and a chaotic and an unmannerly figure in society who resides somewhere in the borderlands of normative society, and they are neither ever fully removed from society or they are never fully incorporated into it, but they live on the edge of normative society. So I will be looking at basically I'll be looking at 19th century literature, Dostoevsky and Dickens, and how they use the tropes, how they have used tropes to portray epilepsy and link those tropes to existing medical attitudes in the 19th century. So by the latter half of the 19th century, the body prone to seizure was consigned away from civilized society to what Jeanette Sterling calls the borderlands of normative society. This idea of the epileptic living on the edge of normative society and never being fully incorporated into it became a recurrent trope in both medical and literary narratives and systems of representation. Sterling writes, and I quote, "Ideas of reliable boundaries that might delineate the potential for disorder and provide a notional space for safe containment had begun to fire the imagination of writers and became a recurring motive in the cultural circuit." Unquote. 19th century literature therefore located the epileptic beyond boundaries of social order. In both Oliver Twist and The Idiot, for example, the epileptic appears as a disordered figure and never a part of mainstream society. Munchkin, for example, from The Idiot, always has an aura of mystery about him from which he emerges at the beginning of the novel and ultimately retreats back into it. Dickens also follows the convention of Seneca and Shakespeare when portraying monks as murderously dangerous and therefore unfit for society. Susan Sontag writes, and I quote, "Illnesses have always been used as metaphors to enliven charges that a society was corrupt or unjust. Disease imagery is used to express concerns for social order, and health is something that everyone is presumed to know about." For Sontag, these metaphors are relatively contentless, and it is not the issue of a specific illness that is at hand, but an issue of larger concern for a larger issue of health that is at hand. By the 19th century, despite persistent efforts, misconceptions about epilepsy remained pervasive in the existing codes of knowledge and systems of representation. As we move into the 19th century, the impulse to modernize epilepsy grows with the emergence of neurology as a specialized field of medicine. Diseases that were deemed incurable or contagious were still specially feared and condemned the sufferer to isolation and stigmatization. Diseases such as epilepsy, pox, tuberculosis were seen as leprosy and others that were seen as mysterious, incurable, shameful, repugnant in real life, provided a sense of excitement and drama to literature. 19th century medical journal Lancet provides evidence of this regressive narrative in an 1884 editorial titled "The Bite of an Epileptic." The article tells the story of a young man who died 3 days after having been bitten by a woman who was in the midst of a quote-unquote convulsively who was in the midst of a seizure, quote-unquote, convulsively biting everything within reach. Even though the author assures the readers that there is no poison in the bite of an epileptic, unlike the bite of a rabid dog, he manages to create a vivid image of an out-of-control feral epileptic body. Sterling notes, and I quote, "At first glance, the hyperbolic style of the item suggests its function is as a curiosity or color piece. of some interest because of its reliance on more ancient superstitions, but of spurious medical value, unquote. A week later, however, the author was forced to defend his claim with this passage that is on the screen right now, that the bite of the epileptic is not poisonous. Ironically, the language that the author chooses to end the piece with further reinforces the bestiality of the epileptic, personality that it aimed to deny. This concern is also reflected in the work of 19th century English physician William Gowers. Gowers performed a detailed study of the epileptic disorder and dubbed a particular category of symptoms theriomimicry. Therio from the Greek word therion, which means animal. Gowers' description of epilepsy was strikingly similar to that of the Hippocratic physicians and showed that the recurrent images of bestiality still continued to hold sway in 19th century medical literature. By the 19th century, efforts in the medical community moved beyond observing pre- and post-ictal states to define a generalized epileptic character. Gowers' idea of a defective, degenerate, and dangerous epileptic remained encoded in the culturally biased codes of signification, and from his position of medical authority, feed back into the circuit of culture, representing the epileptic in bestial metaphors. For Gowers, epilepsy represented a lack of order and control, not just neuronal, but also social and moral. Gowers' anxieties about the social order, which were reflected in his work on epilepsy, betrayed larger issues of class structure and economic progress that plagued 19th century England. Gowers' work became a favorite source for Charles Dickens' novels. Dickens often used epilepsy as a plot device, a moment in the narrative that seizes the reader's imagination and signals a moment of transition. In Oliver Twist, epilepsy marks the divide between Oliver and his half-brother Edward Leaford Monks. The novel delves into issues of class heredity and class hierarchy as the nature over nurture pattern is revealed in the relationship between Oliver and Monks. Despite the unfortunate circumstances of his illegitimate birth at a workhouse, Oliver is seemingly immune to any form of corruption because of his genetic lineage. Janet Sterling writes, and I quote, "The class hierarchy of the novel reinforces an already established framework of what constitutes normality, an innate impulse to bourgeois respectability, and a native moral fiber. Because of his maternal connections to the middle class, Oliver's hereditary legacy ensures reinstatement to his rightful place in the social strata despite the impoverished conditions of his early life. In the social realist novel of the 19th century, nature inevitably wins out over nurture. Oliver will always be normal, Leonard Davis points out, even in abnormal circumstances." Unquote. While Oliver's mother's middle-class decency is reflected in his inherent goodness, which he proves time and again throughout the novel, Monks inherits his parents' moral laxity. Monks's father, Edwin, seduces Oliver's mother, Agnes, with the promise of marriage, while he is still married to Monks's mother. Elizabeth, on the other hand, is given up to continental frivolities and destroys Edwin's will, leaving Agnes, Oliver, and Rose, Oliver's maternal aunt, without any inheritance. It is implied that this genetic corruption is inherited by Edward and manifests as the epileptic disorder when Mr. Brownlow chastises him in this passage. This notion that inner corruption is visible to the perceptive eye and that the face serves as a reliable index into a person's moral character was a popular and recurrent theme in 19th century medical belief systems. It is referenced to not just in Dickens's work, but also in Dostoevsky's works. Just as Monks's immoral character is visible on his body, so too is Oliver's unfailing morality. During Mr. Brownlow and Oliver's first meeting at a court, we are told that Mr. Brownlow registered something in Oliver's face that touches him and evokes a feeling of innocence, even though Oliver stands accused of theft at that very moment. Dickens's conflation of the dark, criminal, morally lax, subhuman epileptic in the character of Monks, who would go as far as killing his half-brother Oliver for his own benefit, foreshadows Gowers' theory of theriomimicry. His work became known for his accurate representations of illness, demonstrating a keen awareness of medical knowledge from centuries before. Dickens made a significant impact on medicine in the 19th century. Dostoevsky in The Idiot, however, takes a slightly different approach. Dostoevsky modeled the prince's character on his own experience of illness, as well as his mock execution in 1894. Out of all of Dostoevsky's characters, Myshkin comes closest to the author's personal life and lived experience of his illness. Even though Prince Myshkin, I'm sorry, you can skip that. The narrative provides little information and absolutely no definitive answers. Prince Myshkin's medical history is only first revealed to the reader in a conversation with Rogojin. The prince is obviously a stranger to his current surroundings and people whom he is first introduced to in the beginning of the novel. Hippolyte, for example, captures the ambiguity in the prince's character when he says he is either a doctor or indeed of extraordinary intelligence and able to guess many things, but ultimately he is an idiot, there can be no doubt at all. Even though throughout the novel, the reader cannot place Myshkin either as a philosopher or as a rogue or as a holy fool, Hippolyte's paradoxical claim establishes one thing, that he is ultimately an idiot for everyone in the novel, just as the title claims. This explains what is wrong with him without fixing it. It diagnoses him. Brian Johnson suggests that questions of identity and diagnosis are inextricably bound together within the novel. He writes, and I quote, Prince Myshkin's stable diagnosis as an idiot serves as the fundamental characteristic for his of his unstable identity, which in turn cannot be divorced from his diagnosis, no matter how his identity is perceived. Johnson argues that the fundamental difficulty in decoding the character of the prince is posed by the narrative technique of the novel. In describing his own condition while in a state of stupor, Myshkin uses the term idiot. However, his use of the term is not meant to be self-deprecatory or derogatory. In fact, he is using the term in that was very much a part of the medical vocabulary of the 19th century. Johnson writes, and I quote, at the time, European physicians used the term idiots and idiotism to refer to a mental disorder that implied not only simple-mindedness, but a degree of unresponsiveness that borders on stupor. Dostoevsky himself uses this term in this manner in a letter of 1867 to Dr. Yanovsky, who was his physician at the time. This epilepsy will end up carrying me off. My memory has grown completely dim. I don't recognize people anymore. I forget what I read the day before. I'm afraid of going mad or falling into idiocy. Unquote. In the 19th century, idiotism along with epilepsy was treated as a separate disorder within itself. Both Pinel and Esquirol wrote extensively on it, and Esquirol asserted that epilepsy sooner or later leads to insanity because of the damage to the brain due to repeated seizures. Esquirol's work separated idiocy from epilepsy and established it as a byproduct of the disorder. In fact, Myshkin's state of stupor has a lot in common with Esquirol's definition of idiocy, hence justifying the title of the book. The passages in the novel that provide the reader with information regarding the prince's medical background are all included within the first 5 chapters of The Idiot. Therefore, the importance of diagnosis of idiocy is foregrounded very early in the novel. The prince's reputation as an idiot must precede him in every consequent scene, determining beforehand the impression that he makes on strangers. According to Johnson, recognition of the epileptic character is one other major motive of the novel. In fact, at the very beginning of the novel, as the reader is introduced to Myshkin, we are told that there was something inherently peculiar about his looks, such that would enable a stranger to recognize the prince as an epileptic. I quote, his eyes were big, blue, and intent. Their gaze had something quiet but heavy about it and was filled with that strange expression which some are able to guess at first sight that the subject has the falling sickness. Temkin mentions this belief in this passage in his book, The Falling Sickness. There are a lot of peculiar traits about the prince in the book. One of them is asexuality or hyposexuality. He never expresses any libidinal inclinations. After their meeting on the train, Rogojin asks Myshkin if he is a great fancier of women after inviting him to stay at his house. Myshkin replies that due to his illness, he is in effect celibate. To which Rogojin replies, and I quote, "You come out as a holy fool, prince, and God loves your kind," unquote. In another instance, when Gania asks the prince if he would marry Nastasia, he replies that he cannot marry at all because he is unwell. These instances surround the prince's character in an aura of sexual chastity, which is integral to the prince's Christ-like personality and his enigma. But it also serves to alienate him from normative society. To conclude, ongoing research in the 19th century was intent on placing the epileptic outside of the standard bell curve. Cesare Lombroso linked epilepsy with pathological criminality or pathological genius. Freud linked the disorder with hysteria. In the popular imagination of the general public, the disease largely incited fear, disgust, pity, and loathing. Large-scale epileptic colonies were established to literally isolate people with epilepsy from the society. By the late 19th century, many journal publications had developed a rhetoric of benevolence that intimately entwined compassion and prejudice to justify the necessity of epileptic colonies. Medical writing had already stereotyped the male epileptic body as dangerously volatile, vulnerable to vice, and feminized by its tendency to disorder and lack of self-control. By the end of the 19th century, the epileptic had become a troublesome marker at the limits of mainstream society. A cipher held the borderlands between normality and abnormality. Thank you.
Very nicely timed. Thank you very much. Question?
This disease was referred to as the falling sickness. And I wonder whether still in the 19th century you came across description.
Yes, Dostoevsky does refer to as falling sickness, St. Vitus's dance, epilepsy. It was known by several different names, but the falling sickness was less and less prevalent. But yes, it was still in use. Yeah.
Well, it was interesting to hear a talk in which a sort of discourse in society gets into literature, and you haven't used in literature as a trope, I think you called it. And the way I read your talk is, say, for example, with the Dickens example, you have this framing within British society, perhaps, which is principally moralistic and therefore can be used to indicate the morals of characters within a novel. Whereas within Dostoevsky, Russian society has a different conception of those in the margins of the borderland. So you mentioned the holy fool, and that's another feature of Russian society, which I think is absent in British society, this association of the divine or holiness with people who are on the borderlands. I don't think we've ever quite done that. Whereas in Russian society, of course, it's get these nice passages in Tolstoy where women sit in the kitchen with holy fools, etc., and things like that, and feed them. So there is that sort of fundamental difference. In terms of Prince Myshkin, then, they clearly mention the holy fool with reference to them, so they're accessing that way of viewing people in the book. So is part of your work, do you think, looking at different discourses in those two societies and the affordances that they give to authors to actually use the representation of epilepsy in order to put different types of, indicate different types of things? In one case, a morally bankrupt, in another case, possibly somebody who's in touch with the divine.
Right. So currently, I'm not looking at that, but in the future, definitely, like how culturally the disease is contextualized and looked at differently, definitely. But also, one major difference between Dickens and Dostoevsky is that Dickens did not have epilepsy and Dostoevsky did.
Okay.
So he
Lived
has
experience.
lived
Yeah.
experience. So he has a different perspective on when Dostoevsky, for example, talks about portraying Myshkin as a holy fool, then he might be coming from a different place of experience. Whereas when when Dickens portrays an epileptic as morally corrupt, then that might be cultural difference. It might be that he was, it might be perspective, lived experience. It might be that they were just reading different medical texts. So they have, again, different perspectives. It could be a number of factors. But for me, the lived experience part of it is a huge factor.
And how much of, I know very little about Dostoevsky, but how much of his own writings exist so that you can sort of frame your approach to the work by understanding what he wrote about his experiences of epilepsy, perhaps?
He wrote very little. He whatever exists in the records are through letters between friends and him.
Yeah.
Some in his diaries, notebooks for his novels. But there is not a lot that is verifiable. Like one major thing that is missing in Dostoevsky's records about his illness is that when exactly did it begin, which is very, very much debated to this date and has caused a lot of debate.
Is it thought to have begun before he started writing, or is the possibility that it occurs during his career and influences his writings?
No, it very much did occur during his career. But the bigger question is, did it occur before he was sent to Siberia or afterwards? Because he used it as an excuse to get out of Siberia. Yeah, I would. But was he seeking treatment for it before or not is still, like, Freud uses it as an excuse to blame it on the death of his father, because, like, according to him, he had like hysterical epilepsy when his father died. He says that is when he experienced his first seizure, as guilt for having murdered his father, not literally, like psychologically, whatever. That is when he experienced his first seizure, according to him, even though there is no proof that that actually happened. So that's still an issue of debate.
Okay.
Yeah.
Any other points? If not, that was a great talk. Thank you very much. It was great having you.